respect to a DEI is more than just the numbers. And I've certainly, in my preparation and reading of some of the reports and various material related to the cardiology workforce, I certainly recognize that there is a challenge with the pipeline in terms of representation. And that's typical across the health professions in general, with respect to certain demographic groups. But in a deeper reading, I begin to understand that that's more of a symptom, if you will, than a cause. So let me back out and do a more formal introduction. So I'm Kevin Harris, Senior Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the School of Medicine. I've been formally in this role since March 25th, I believe. I did have an interim stint as an interim Senior Associate Dean from July of 2020 throughout my starting permanently. But my experience at VCU goes back to for over 14 years now. December actually would make 15 years, but who's counting? And largely in the Vice President of the Health Sciences Office, focused certainly on diversity, equity, and inclusion, but that was one of a number of areas that I had responsibility for. So for me, this is a great coming home, having started my professional career at the AAMC in the Division for Diversity Policy and Programs. So I'm excited to be in medicine in general, certainly excited to be able to focus on DEI work more intently and intensely, and certainly excited to have an opportunity to share with cardiology colleagues, in particular because I have a lived experience through my mother just this past over a year or so, as she experienced an aortic valve replacement procedure. And this was throughout COVID. In fact, it was kind of in that earlier stages of COVID when we began the process. And so I have a deep appreciation, quite frankly, for the skill sets and the expertise and knowledge that cardiologists have, and certainly other health professionals who care for my mother along the way. But the relief that she was able to get through the procedure she underwent was nothing but a good feeling and a wonderful sort of renewed feeling for her. And again, it was attributed to the skillfulness of the physician and team around her. So this was particularly important as I was preparing, because I had certainly a professional lens in which I looked at the preparation, but also had a personal lens in which I looked at the preparation. So I'll dive right in, since we've kind of lost a little bit of time. Next slide, please. Great. So we're going to focus on 4 areas. And again, we may move some things around if you all see fit. Certainly ask questions if you have them. I'll try to save time for Q&A at the end. But I want to level set on what we know about diversity. And I'm using diversity very generally, very, very, very loosely in this space. But what we know about it. So I've found that over the years, it's important to get a grounding of what we mean, and particularly what I mean in this presentation about diversity and where it's positioned in the conversation. When I said the word, I would suspect that a number of you had your ideas about what diversity is. And I would suspect that if we were to poll and go around the Hollywood Zoom squares here, that we get some very similar notions around what it means, certainly around race and gender and some of the demographic pieces. And we may even get some of those other notions around inclusion and how it connects with diversity and equity and those kinds of things. But there would be some varied senses of what diversity is. And certainly I've learned over time that in our conceptual view of diversity, that there are different pathways and that people look at it. And I want to just set the stage initially with how I view diversity and how it will inform the conversation we'll have. And then we'll spend a little time on the cardiology landscape looking at the numbers, if you will, but not that much. I don't want to get trapped or too enamored with I call it the diagnosis of phase of this discussion. We know the numbers. I'm sure you all are quite familiar with the demographic breakout and the projections for workforce for cardiology, but it's important to at least, again, put that information out there so that we're operating off the same foundation. What I want to spend the balance of my time in is the why and how DEI matters in cardiology spaces and education and clinical practice and research in those areas. And then end with what I hope would be some practical and useful ideas based upon my understanding from the literature and just my understanding in general about DEI. Some ideas that you all may want to think about or may want to entertain. And I certainly am going to be a partner in that process as we move along. Next slide, please. All right, so let's out of the gate. Let's start with one area that I think is important for us to understand about diversity, and at least for you to understand in this presentation how I view diversity, and that is that diversity just is, and just plain and simple, it just is. And so I've been in a lot of conversations over the years, as you can imagine, where the language goes as, we need diverse faculty, or we need to bring diversity into this space, or this I'm not diverse. I've actually had colleagues say to me, I'm not diverse. And I've come to really understand that is a root cause of some of the confusion, I think, and challenges that we face in trying to really embrace and work with diversity in a way that it benefits us in terms of our primary goals, our primary mission, particularly for units such as cardiology. And so it's important to know that, and I frame it, that there's no null set for diversity. There's no occasion in which diversity, particularly when you're talking about human interaction and human dynamics, there's no occasion where diversity is not at play. And for some, that's a tough concept because we've been socialized to believe that certain demographics bring diversity. If women bring diversity, African Americans bring diversity, people who are disabled bring diversity, when in fact, in the situation in which that occurs, diversity is already at play. And what we haven't been framed to think about or socialized to think about is that we're to uncover and untap that diversity before that, quote, demographic that will bring diversity comes to a situation. So all that's to say is that there's no null state. And so Neil deGrasse Tyson puts it eloquently for me. I love how he phrases it from his scientific mind, is that we're just all connected. It's just a fact. And biologically, chemically, and atomically. So that's important to understand how I present this material, because I don't see a world where diversity doesn't exist. I don't see a situation where we shouldn't have to think about how we're engaging each other. Are there equity or power dynamics that we need to negotiate and navigate? Is there the appropriate sense of belongingness, a sense of mattering for all the individuals and stakeholders that might be in a given situation? And so, again, that's important for us to know. Next slide, please. The next issue, and this is the elephant in the room, and this is race. Again, no mystery that if you're talking about diversity, that the issue or the concept of race will be front and center in most of those discussions. And certainly over the past year, we've come to appreciate with the situations with George Floyd and others in terms of race and interfacing with policing. Race certainly has always been an implication for education and housing and healthcare. It's just a part of who we've become as a country. But again, important to know about how I frame diversity and how I look at it through the work that I do, is this prescient comment by Rosa Parks, one of our pioneers in our civil rights movement, that I believe there's only one race, the human race. And so that's been a framing for me for some time now. prior to even understanding the specifics, prior to having any sense of the Genome Project, I began to understand that my connectivity, when you peel back sort of what's under the hood, that there's very much that differentiates. There's very little that differentiates us as a human species. So again, I think that's important. And it's certainly now science is starting to really codify that understanding, particularly around what we're understanding through the human genome, and understanding that 99.9% of who we are is who we are, right, collectively. But we've certainly managed, particularly in this country, but not exclusively in this country, to make that less than 1%, that pigmentation component, have an inordinate amount of time in our psyche and in our DNA, when in fact that is, and I'll say openly, in many cases, the least important aspect, and certainly one that none of us chose. So anyway, next slide. Important to know. It's also, so the whole idea is that race is made up, right? And I don't think there's a debate. This is what we know. This is what we know. It's not very little debate about it. Race is made up. It's a social construct. If you look at Anthony Mark's work, he talks about how Brazil and the United States, in South Africa, used the concept of race for political and social ends, for power, for it was important to have this external expression of who we are and our humanness serve as a way to easily parse out the haves and the have-nots. And so this was intentional. This was made up. This was whole cloth. This was, it had not certainly noble intents, but the important point is that it's not real in some senses, particularly from the genetic world, from the biological world. It's made up. But Dr. Dorothy Roberts actually took it a bit further, and I'm really enamored by her work right now in talking about race and this insidious role that it's begin to play and how it's begin to pollute medicine. Not begin, but how it has polluted medicine, right? And the ways in which we think about race in the medical spaces, particularly in the clinical spaces, but also how we train and educate our students, given race more credence, more responsibility, more contribution than it actually has, even in clinical decision making. And she's uncovering that work and sharing that work. And it's leading to a movement that I hope will take foot and take hold, so that we, at least in medicine, begin to sort of depollute or decontaminate race, the idea of race and how it impacts us at the biological, at the clinical phases. Next slide, please. And that movement has actually been codified in terms of shifting from what we call race-based medicine, this idea that race has important relevance, essential relevance as a biological variable, that it certainly has currently now implications in our clinical practice, but many scholars believe is also fostering continuing health inequities. And we're beginning to shift, and the conversation is beginning to shift toward a concept of race, more so as race conscience, right? And meaning that race as a social construct certainly has an influence, but it's driving some social determinants. It's certainly driving sort of how people have access to certain services or access to certain resources. And so the idea that maybe racism is more of a factor than this, again, socially constructed variable that we call race. And it's certainly a shift toward looking at our ancestry, and our genomics is starting to really share this. And I was just thinking, my wife did the 23andMe and some of the other genetic codes to determine if she had certain segments of representation in her DNA. And I looked at the excitement and even some disappointment, quite honestly, as she got those results, right? But with that, we were talking about ancestry, you know, geographically, where things accumulated at a genetic level. right? And so it moves on and even touches upon cardiology, and how in cardiology, there's even in terms of looking at the use of race-specific equations, and looking at atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. And I hope I pronounced that correctly. It's the reason why I'm not a physician. But again, these are areas that are starting to be discussed in a richness. That let's begin to look at racism. Let's look at the structures, the environment. We know through epigenetics that our DNA are impacted by these environmental factors. And so we want to begin to look at how we reshape and transform the conversation in medicine to where this socially constructed, manufactured, synthetic concept of race doesn't have an inordinate presence in the work that we do. Next slide, please. And so what we know, and this again, this is what is coming out in our research and our literature, is that racism now has raised to the level of concern that it's considered a public health crisis. And we've known this for some time, but it's now becoming, at least in 27 states, a reality in terms of policy and in our public sector and our governmental leadership in terms of how race is positioned in their thinking. And so Virginia declared in February 2021 that yes, race is a public health crisis. We need to look at it more deeply. We need to understand it, unpack it more deeply, insert it more deeply into certain conversations. Studies, again, have shown across multiple industries the impact of race and how it drives disparities, whether it be housing, whether it be education, our criminal justice system, our employment, and even more so in the COVID experience that we've just had. We understood very early that racism had a factor in how even our neighborhoods experienced COVID, that linked back to policies and social decisions that were made decades ago. Some would even say centuries ago. And then the AAMC shared in a podcast that that race also has three ways in which it affects us. There's just the violent acts, right? And we understand what those acts have been over time. And then there's also those nonviolent acts. And this is one that's important that Dr. David Williams out at Harvard has uncovered in terms of how the nonviolent act and its connection with stress has implications for us. And then certainly we're seeing even now how ideology, segregation, those issues, those realities for some, how they impact us. So racism, is a strong case to be made, is a driving factor. Next slide, please. And so unpacking David Williams' work a little bit more, he talks about how race, again, and the issue of stress. And now for years and prior to reading his work, and even coming up through high school and early college, it was just this, socialization or just reality, but it's this overhead that you kind of always had, particularly as an African-American male, navigating certain spaces. And I just termed it overhead. It's baked in the cake. It's just what it is. But he began through his everyday discrimination scale and some of his other work, begin to really document and codify the impact of racism in the psyche of this country. And I would dare say, yes, he focuses on the inordinate impact that it has on certain minority or marginalized populations. But I would dare say that no one escapes, right, the impact that it has had in this country. And so he talks about the biological reaction to it, the physiological reactions that we have. He even talks about, again, the linkages of stress and anticipation. And this was the part that really jumps out, and I'm diving deeper into this literature. Just the anticipated impact of violence and other disadvantages is having an impact around some health outcomes and disease patterns. And then he certainly focuses on the issue around housing and segregation and the disruptive force that's been in our American life experience. And that if you could just eliminate residential segregation, if you could just begin to parse out, to really congregate and dismantle places where there are pockets of individuals, again, from this socially constructed race framework, that are just living together in a very narrowed experience, often concentrated with poverty, often concentrated with limited opportunities. That if you could just eliminate that, then you actually address a lot of other issues that we face around education and employment and social mobility. Next slide, please. So I'm focusing on what we know, and I'm trying to level set us for the next part of the conversation. But race matters, and so here's how, and here's why. This is just a part of who we've been, right? If you think about in our court system, in our legal system, I mean, there's a pretty convincing and compelling track record around race and our inability, in most cases, to effectively position it where it needs to be. And even now, as we move up the ladder of our conversations around race in our legal and judicial system, we even now having the possibility of a conversation around even critical race theory, just the mentioning that race might play a role in how we navigate in the American experience. Just the mention of it in our text is now being challenged and may end up very soon in a court near you. So again, race matters. It still matters, even though it has an inordinate position in medicine. It still matters in our social construct, so in our social experience. So we'll use that framing and that dichotomy, if you will, that in many cases race doesn't matter as a fundamental biological variable, but because it permeates pretty much all that we do in terms of our policies and our practices, at least in the American experience, that we have to give it due attention if we're going to begin to understand how to address some of the challenges that our communities face. We got to just continue to work through that dichotomy in our heads. Next slide, please. And so that's where we'll start the presentation. Next slide, please. All right, so the cardiology landscape. Next slide, thank you. All right, and so just a quick look again, not to spend time again in this diagnosis phase. We know the numbers, and we know what, particularly around gender or sex in the cardiology space, and looking at sort of a comparison between those in fellowships and how the numbers are pretty much a plateau. There's been some, I call it signal and noise. I kind of look at these slides through sort of a signal and noise lens. So there's some signal, there's some noise sort of around shifting around gender, particularly male, female, again, and that's an issue, a separate issue all in of itself in terms of how we frame the gender conversation around just male and female, but we'll stay with what we have. And so there's some noise certainly around in terms of some shifts in terms of women gaining some traction within particularly adult cardiology fellowships, and then even slightly so within the cardiology workforce in general. With peds, it's a little bit more profound, and there's more of a convergence, right? Between getting, I guess, if we want a gender balance, if you will, particularly in the fellowships, not as much noise, if you will, if you look at the actual cardiology workforce, and that might be a denominator issue that we're working with there. But the signals kind of go toward where we would want to see, particularly with the percentage of women in our population, and we know the impact in terms of women healthcare and some propensions toward or proclivities toward women to want to be treated in certain situations by women. I just had that conversation with my wife about selecting a new primary care physician and her preferences there. It's just the reality. But the signal's going in the right place. Next slide, please. Less so around race, right? And again, this is the categories that the boxes that we've checked over time, that we've self-selected and placed ourselves in over time. Not so much, right? It's a little bit more muddier, a little bit more murkier. Certainly there's a plateau, and that's a consistent plateau around what we would call underrepresented minorities, African Americans, Hispanic, Native Americans, although the Hispanic population has the sort of some signals and going in a different direction that are looking more positive in terms of access in the field. And let me just put a footnote. When I talk in these terms about the right direction or, we're moving in a positive trend, I'm careful not to position this as that, you know, in the gender case, that males are wrong in cardiology, right? Or in the race context, that somehow white men or white males are wrong in cardiology. I'm very careful, I hope, not to give that impression. The way I view this is that, are we unnecessarily repelling individuals who could contribute to the field? And that's the way I've always approached recruitment, particularly in the student space. I felt that my job was to uncover, to turn over every rock, to make sure that wherever talent is, that it's allowed to express itself equally and fairly within the process toward a health career. So I'm not necessarily trying to say that one thing is bad or another, and that for me, that it's just, you know, grand sort of elation if, you know, more women or more African Americans. That's kind of not where I am. I'm more focused on, are we repelling talent that could help us solve the problems and the challenges that we face as a society around healthcare and in the field of cardiology. That's kind of where I frame it. But nonetheless, the numbers say that there's some plateaus again. So the noise is a little bit more muddier, more stable in terms of certain demographic groups still not getting traction within the cardiology field. And again, I see this as just people will leave and talent will leaving on the bench, if you want to frame it in that way. Talent will leaving on the bench. Next slide, please. Some of the key factors when I begin to unpack and ask the question, well, why? I actually started with, why do people choose cardiology? And I actually came across some interesting literature and a few blogs that really helped me to appreciate the opportunities in cardiology, right? This is not all doom and gloom, but the opportunities, and the job security came up, and the limitless opportunities to explore your scientific and passions and your interests within cardiology, the groundbreaking impact that you're having with the science. I just shared about my experience with my mom. So I started there, but again, began to look at, but why the numbers don't match the sentiment. And I began to look at sort of the impact of cardiology and the culture of cardiology. And this is where I believe that the numbers are not necessarily the whole story. A study indicated that residents found that men in cardiology were typically choosing it because of its their interest, their attraction to the field. And there was indicators, some 14 indicators, and it indicated that 10 out of those 14 indicators were sort of positive toward men in terms of choosing cardiology. They were affirmative reasons why we choose cardiology. It then conversely indicated that women actually were looking more at those things that were deterrents, and it drove their decision. And so it starts to make sense in some of the numbers. While we can see increases in internal medicine for women, but not the same increases in cardiology in terms of entering the field. And so the environment, when I begin to unpack, what about the culture? And so the lack of diversity, and again, when we say a lack of diversity, one way to think about it is that diversity from a representation place suggests legitimacy, right, of a particular area. If you were to walk in a particular department and not see anyone just at a surface level that looks like you, that may have had the same experiences, we do it as sort of a proxy in many cases. That unfortunately, the way we've been socialized is that and the way that this world has worked, we actually have to begin to make some decisions about what we think our experience would be. Would we be accepted? Am I expected to bring diversity? That kind of conversation. And certainly so, adverse job conditions, impact on family life. Those are factors that, again, are we planning for those, or do we have commensurate strategies to address those? That's the question we want to ask. With respect to retention, slower advancement, greater harassment and discrimination. These are actually typical. I've looked at a number of different disciplines and fields, and these seem to come up. And I'm very interested in seeing, at least at VCU, how can we begin to meet these head on. But increased burnout. So that's that attrition factor. People just checking out because of the not the work itself necessarily, but the dynamics around the work. And then certainly disparities in compensation. I'd say those things, we do this, certainly medicine is of the heart. You have to love this to go through. I just talked with the incoming medical students. And as I'm talking to them, thinking like, you're going to experience 4 years that you just will never forget. You're gonna have some challenges that and obstacles and triumphs, but this is going to be so impactful for you. This gotta be a matter of the heart for you. This can't be a brain thing. It's got to be a matter of the heart. And so, but it's not a hobby. And so compensation does matter. And that's a fact. And we know that from cardiology, it was stated that the numbers are important, but not sufficient. And certainly we know the impact, looking from our HR lens, of how an environment, both the culture and the climate in an environment, as they say, climate and culture, they eat strategies, lunch every day, breakfast and dinner as well. Next slide, please. And I want to speed it up a bit to make sure we get to questions. All right, so how it matters in the cardiology spaces. Next slide, please. So why it matters. And so this slide, and I'm sure many of you all have seen this coming out of Center for Society and Health and Steve Wilkes' group, that really talked about the disparities in life expectancy in this area within, a stone's throw between communities. You're looking at sometimes 15 to 20 year gaps in life expectancy, right? I lived in Gilpin Court for part of my teenage years. I lived in Churchill as well. It wasn't the Churchill I see now. A little more gentrified, but Gilpin Court certainly, unfortunately, looks like it looked when I lived there in the late 70s. And at that point, certainly I didn't understand it. We didn't have much, but we had each other. We were a community. It's what I had. But now looking at this from this lens and understanding, and again, I view this as people we're leaving off the bench, or in this case, people who are just totally being wiped away from the game altogether, unnecessarily. 63 years in a Gilpin Court and 80 years just 5 miles up the road. So that was the why. Next slide, please. And so moving toward, what do we do? And here's the practical thoughts, at least, or ideas that I think might work. Next slide, please. I was struck by actually the amount of effort and thinking that have gone toward the field of cardiology, and in terms of prescriptions for how to address some of the more challenging issues. And so in my work, I came across, and again, this is, I'm sure, for many of you, not new material, but the Diversity and Inclusion Initiative, and particularly the strategic plan by the American College of Cardiology. And it's it had some areas that focused on structure, building structures, that focused on culture as some of its objectives. It certainly focused on looking at from an equity lens. And actually, I was impressed, and I would encourage you, if you haven't spent time with it, to really do that, because it actually is more action-oriented or prescriptive than some of the strategic plans. In fact, I think they've merged more of an operational structure to the strategic plan. And there's some real tangible, accessible ideas that they have peppered throughout that plan. A blueprint, if you will. Certainly comprehensive. Certainly, I looked at some of the individuals who were involved with the creation of it. And again, some great thinkers on this. David Acosta, who's the Chief Diversity Officer at the AAMC, was involved in this as well. So some good thinkers around how to move cardiology beyond just, again, dealing with the symptoms, which are the workforce numbers, but then looking at the underlying culture. And how do we build in the structures to sustain a culture and a presence and a perspective of cardiology that actually not repels, but actually draws in. So I would encourage you to take a look at that if you haven't had an opportunity. Very robust plan. And then there was another model that struck me. It was Diversity 4.0, and it reminded me of a colleague of mine, Mark Neve, while at the AAMC, created a framework around diversity called Diversity 3.0. And so needless to say, this was sort of a play off of of Mark Neve's work, but actually a very deep, comprehensive approach to addressing not just the culture, but both the representation, the ability to increase or limit or reduce health disparities, mitigating the negative impact of social determinants from a health equity lens. I mean, that model and frameworks touched all the bases. And in that work, I found, again, some very accessible ideas around how cardiology can address the workforce profile through addressing the root causes around culture, climate, and just how people experience cardiology, and to begin to look at diversity, equity, inclusion, and then added that whole piece around belongingness in there. Next slide, please. And so here's some thoughts that I had that I would hope you would just ponder, and maybe we'll have an opportunity to even discuss at a deeper level over time. One, I would strongly suggest benchmarking where we are now. And this is me now with my VCU hat on and speaking with just the Department of Cardiology. If you haven't done so, I would benchmark sort of where the department is, both clinical, educational, research, the whole gamut. Just benchmark it against some of the strategies and ideas that are put forth, both in the strategic plan from ACC as well as the Diversity 4.0 framework that's available and growing in the literature. So I would just kind of look at those and tease out those ideas, those recommendations, and begin to just kind of benchmark them. How are we in this area? How are we in terms of structure? How are we attending to mentorship? How are we attending to the climate around discrimination? How are we attending to that pay equity, right? And begin to just use that as a diagnostic tool or exercise to begin to then plan and develop strategies. Next, I define and document why diversity matters. This is important. We've done this at the School of Medicine, and I think it's going to really serve us well. But if you haven't had the opportunity, take a look at the DEI statement that was developed over the course of a few months back in 2020 leading into 2021. And this is a statement that actually captures through a collaborative process who we are in the DEI space. It's a value statement. It's public. People can hold it accountable, can build expectations off of it. Who we are, who we want to be as educators, who we want to be, and who are we as learners, as a workforce, right? And so if you haven't had that developed in cardiology, that's the starting point, because that's where the conversations are going to kind of meld in between, from a diversity lens, who we aspire to be and how it connects with our mission and the patients we treat and the students that we teach. And also begin to look at leadership and messaging and sort of how that modeling works. This is sort of a top-down type of opportunity. And certainly from the literature, there was literature that has called leadership in cardiology to really begin to think about systems change and to be transformative in some of the ways. And I actually certainly have commensurate attention and effort and resources provided to actually move this battleship, right, a few degrees in a certain direction. And so we have opportunities here. We have resources here. There's an IXL DEI certificate program that is being recruited for even now. That's coming out of Dr. Shir Nassim's office in Inclusive Excellence. That's specifically looking at senior leadership and engaging senior leadership in deep conversations about what diversity means, what inclusion means, what equity means from a conceptual and an operational space. And the context of it is not what it means for its own end, but what does it mean for actually driving excellence in your area, for helping to achieve the mission and goals in your area. So we have resources that are available to help leadership begin to not just message the matter, but also model the matter. Training and development, IXL again has a broad educational platform in which there is courses around implicit bias, courses around microaggressions, courses around authentically engaging our community, courses around health equity and social determinants. And so, you know, having the members of cardiology, our cardiology colleagues, engage those courses and training would could be an important part of the transformation, or at least addressing some of the challenges that we might face, as well as the MCV faculty is an important part of it. And so we developed over time with the partnership with the Vice President's Office of a faculty development program for health sciences faculty that really focuses on structural racism and health equity, and how do we better incorporate that in our curriculum so that the next generation of our healthcare professionals are coming from VCU with an adeptness in this space. Want to maximize engagement. Some of the literature I came across, and it was around happiness and lifestyle for cardiologists, and I wasn't able to, I was enamored by it, but I wasn't able to add it in. But it actually focused on cardiologists not being engaged. Typically, again, this is typically, may not be here at VCU, but not being as engaged in sort of the social milieu of the university, not as engaged in some of the training, not as engaged in some of the support systems that might be available, even in cases where burnout or depression or other things might be in place, not potentially accessing those services at the rates that might be useful. So more engagement around this work. And we have an opportunity now through VCU's History and Health Initiative that we're planning a full curriculum with badging, digital badging attached to it, where we can begin to understand and unpack VCU's history, particularly around cardiology. And as you'll know, the book, The Organ Thieves, that kind of documents some of the heart transplant situation with Mr. Tucker, right? But we want to not just sit there in that history and wallow in it, but we're actually trying to then have it be operationalized in contemporary terms. How does our history not confine us or define us? Because we're certainly even different now than what that history foretold. But I would encourage you to engage that work as it comes out. And then looking at the clinical environment, we're developing, a number of us have been trained as trainers around the stepping in model at UVA. And this is pretty much the idea around how do you address real-time discrimination and bias that occurs in the clinical spaces that can become so disruptive to particularly in terms of how we train, but even in how we might treat patients. And then how do you certainly engage those patients that might come to us with certain ideas about who we are and certain demographics that they may not find appealing? How do we deal with that so that we can get the business of caring for our patients in the forefront and keep it in the forefront? And then certainly curriculum transformation. We're working with, particularly in the School of Medicine, a recent curriculum review in which the students' voice was pretty, it was just amazing at the level of understanding they had about race and racism and where it's positioned in medicine and where it's positioned at the course level, and how we might begin to, again, decontaminate sort of this issue of race out of medicine and reposition racism as a more important factor to consider. And so that's work that's continuing as we speak now. And so next slide, please. With that, I'll stop, and I hope I've left a few minutes here for some questions and dialogue. And again, apologies for the technical issues, the late start, but let's engage. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. All right. If the audience have any question, please just put it in the chat or just take over and ask away. And Shannon, maybe we can put on that CME credit PowerPoint again so people can get that credit too.
Kevin, thank you for just such an eye-opening presentation and talk. You know, I think we may even get you to come back and speak at our faculty meeting on a few points. Really interesting to me, the concept that some of the social determinants of health related to racism, yeah, as opposed to, you know, many of us do research and we're all, you know, we use race as a covariate.
Yeah.
But
exactly.
Maybe what's going on are the environmental factors that are impacting a certain group of people because of their social situation dictated, you said it very well, by centuries of racism and separation and all kinds of things. I mean, I think on the scientific side, a lot of work for us to do to uncouple those issues. You showed that map of the Richmond and surrounding areas, and when you probe that deeper, it's interesting that many of the deaths are related to cardiovascular disease.
Exactly.
And so here, our location of our medical center, we might be really well suited to help unravel some of these questions that you so nicely and elegantly described for us. You mentioned also toward the end the University of Virginia, the Stepping Up program, and you and I have had conversations, when I'm maybe, working and evaluating certain situations, either with my colleagues or with patients.
Yeah.
I may not be aware of how I may be manifesting racism. So this Stepping Up program that you said at UVA, and you mentioned that you're developing something here, could you describe that a little more, and how would folks seek to get involved or participate in something like that?
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Hanley, for your comments. And certainly I'd be thrilled to come back and just continue the dialogue, but actually roll my sleeves up as well and help to develop some strategy. But the it's actually Stepping In program. UVA developed a model over 5 years ago, I believe, in which they used a reader's theater form to help to unpack discrimination in the clinical space, or bias that occurs in the clinical space, and how do you address it real time, and some of the examples. And so they've created a menu of vignettes with different situations, whether it be a patient that may express that they don't want a particular demographic to care for them, or a colleague, and it's just a hallway conversation in passing, and a remark is made that is a bit off color and off-putting. And what do we do in those situations? And we've had certainly situations at VCU, even recently, where this work is pretty salient. What do you do? And that's the question that their program tries to address. And so they in that training, they provide the vignettes, and then there's an opportunity for then those participants in that workshop to then model and work through what actually is the best approach to mitigate these situations, to get maybe clarity where it might have been just miscommunication, or in some cases where it's just out and out bias or discrimination. How do you address that so that it doesn't disrupt care, but also in terms of the way we train, we're a training environment that it allows for us to then have those conversations with our residents, with our medical students, about how do you process these situations so that they're not being disenchanted, or at worst, because of a certain demographic not being accessible to certain patients. That means that, again, this might be a procedure or an experience that may be lacking or not as guaranteed to occur over the course of this student's life. There are actually training implications. If a patient says, I don't want a Muslim student, I don't want an African-American student to touch me, forget not forget, but in addition to the psychological and emotional impact that would have on that learner, then you're thinking about the experience that learner is now stripped from. And so Stepping In is actually, there are 20 of us that will be trained over the month of September to actually be trainers ourselves. So we'll have the capacity at VCU to then begin to work with units across the institution. Dr. Kellerman in Health Sciences has actually supported this initiative so that we're allowed to do it. And then we're going to be about the business of building more capacity, finding faculty, finding leaders, finding staff who actually will also be willing to be trained in this particular model, so that then as we begin to work with units on the floor, we can at least remove the ambiguity around what to do. There's probably some policy pieces we'll need to put in place as well to help shore up some areas. But at least from a practical sense, once we're developed in terms of our training, we can then go out and be ambassadors for then how do we handle these situations now and in real time. So I'm excited about it. There are some other models out there. In fact, a number of our faculty are involved. Kate Donowitz and Clifton Lee has another model that they're working with our theater department on as well. Our PM&R group with Dr. Anna Mills is also looking at developing some models for addressing discrimination. So I think once we have these models in place, we're going to be really equipped. If we engage it, we're going to be equipped as an institution to begin to ratchet down some of the numbers around climate and culture, not just in cardiology, but across our health system.
Thank you. Sounds like after your training in September, maybe we revisit with you in October.
Absolutely. We're going to be pretty aggressive in reaching out to each department. Our goal is that each department has this opportunity to have this conversation and hopefully even develop some additional skill sets around this work.
All right.
I see there's a comment in chat. Thank you, Dr. Shaw. Appreciate the encouragement. Any other thoughts, questions, concerns? Let's have a chat.
Dr. Harris, this is Wendy Bonner. Thank you so much for a great presentation. One question I had that you and also Dr. Hunley have alluded to, but just wanted to get your thoughts on, is about race and research. And, you know, just a simple fact, you can't pick up a journal and look at their table 1 of demographics and not see race broken down. And
Right.
that, you know, the question is, how is that useful? Because like you mentioned, it is a very artificial construct. And what are your thoughts around that? And any ideas on how we can approach that differently?
Yeah, great. That's a great question. Thank you, Dr. Bonner. So what is being proposed, particularly in this framework around race-conscious medicine, and research is sort of subsumed within that as well, is that we begin to just kind of dig deeper, take a second and third order of questions and thinking around, you know, what's presented as an issue that's caused by race, that we actually unpack it more and just ask the questions around, so what's really driving this, right? Because it's not likely. So the challenge for us is, again, just think about, I thought about putting up a slide with Barack Obama and Barack Obama's parents, a white mother and an African father, or Kamala Harris, Indian and Caribbean descent. So in a research study with those two individuals, what category are you putting them in? Like how do you factor in their quote race? They're pitched as the first African-American president, the first Black president, the first Black vice president. That's what we'd see in the media and in the news. That's what our communities are heralding. But at the bench in a research study, how do you negotiate that? That their ancestry is mixed. And so what's salient, where, right? And so that's the questions we got to begin to ask that starts to make race less of a driver, but certainly something you want to pay. We categorize ourselves. And so what it suggests is that there might have been a common set of experiences because of how race plays itself out in our society, that there might have been a common set of experiences that we might want to begin to factor in. And that's when we start putting on that health equity lens and start looking at it through from a social determinants. What are some of the other factors that actually might be at play that might even have more of an impact than what I might have chose to categorize myself on a census form? And so that's what it's asking of researchers and clinicians, of our scientists, is that we just unpack it more and not kind of stop at that point. But again, those charts, those reports, they are an expression of what I talked about when I showed the slide of the legal course of our racial decisions or our decisions around race in this country. It just permeates all we do. You know, and I'm certainly not suggesting we live in an alternate universe where we ignore those categorizations. But when it comes down to the science, to the clinical treatments, to our decision making in those spaces, that we just have to kind of unpack it a bit more and begin to look at. Yeah. So
I
anyway,
think that's a
I'm
great
related.
point. And, one thought I've had, I think we would have to work pretty hard to figure out how to implement this. But, for some conditions that we're studying, if we know that certain genes may be more or less involved, should we just completely scrap the race part of table 1 and simply describe people by, presence or absence of certain alleles? I think the problem is there's so many things that we're studying where we don't know what genes we should be categorizing people
Right.
by.
Exactly. Yeah. And again, I think Dr. Dorothy Roberts' work, I think it's really worth putting some time toward, because again, she goes a lot deeper, being a physician herself, to really understanding how in a clinical sense, we can begin to sort of mitigate or remove the reliance on race as a biological variable, and begin to look at more factors around whether it be structural racism or just our structures in general, our experiences in general. She really delves into that with some very concrete approaches that as clinicians you might want to consider. And actually, it would be great to have her here. That's certainly something that I love to put some time toward, is to get her here, and maybe she's doing a grand rounds at some point, or some other presentation, because her work is actually pretty transformative, connected with David Williams' work out of Harvard that he's been at for decades now, in helping us to understand the physiological impacts and the biological impacts of racism, the structure, the system, racism versus pigmentation itself. I'm probably running out of time, and I certainly want to be respectful of y'all's time. I could stay here for a few more minutes, but again, I just want to be mindful. I wish I had that 7 or 8 minutes that we lost in the beginning. But I'm grateful for this opportunity. Again, it had both a professional and a personal importance to me as I was preparing this talk. But actually, again, there's a lot of work ahead that I'm certainly game for being a partner in that. And so I look forward to returning at some point, maybe in a workshop capacity, and we help to just figure out some of the strategies moving forward.
Absolutely. We'll definitely have you back, Dr. Harris. Thank you again for the talk.
Thank you so much.